Welcome to Moments with Marianne. This is your host, Marianne Pastana. And we're here today with special guest, Donna Simmons, who's here to share with us her new book, Ashes to Flame, Transforming Trauma into Purpose. What if the key to healing your own trauma lies in breaking the patterns your family never could? Well, today's guest is here to share with us just that. Donna Simmons is a wife, mother, author, and dedicated advocate for breaking cycles of generational trauma and supporting mental health recovery. Appointed by the governor to the Kentucky Juvenile Justice Advisory Board, she collaborates with leaders across the state to reduce juvenile system involvement and strengthen protective factors for at-risk youth. A survivor of child abuse and exploitation, Donna's personal journey fuels her mission to help others transform pain into purpose. Her memoir, Ashes to Flame, chronicles her experience of survival and healing, encouraging others to uncover their own inner resilience. Donna's story has been featured in Good Housekeeping, Glamour, NPR, PBS, and Fox News, among many others. She's a frequent speaker, trainer, and panelist at both national and international conferences and has testified before legislative committees advocating for systematic change. So welcome to the show, Donna Simmons.
Thank you so much, Marianne. It's wonderful to be able to speak with you today.
What an honor it is to have you here and to talk about your new book and your journey. My goodness. Can you share with us a little bit about your story?
Absolutely. So, when I was in my early 30s, which was about 10 years ago at this point, I actually began experiencing chronic panic attacks, and they became so debilitating. And they were these very terrifying, painful experiences, but they ultimately led me to realize that I was holding in so much toxicity because I was hiding so much of my past behind this veil of perfectionism and ambition. There were so many secrets and silence and shame that I was carrying. And it was all driving me to experience these immense feelings of isolation and despair. And just, I was desperate at the time to find a sense of community. And so I started connecting with organizations that started empowering me to feel comfortable owning the truth of my past and starting to remove the veil from the secrets of the generational trauma that existed within my family. And through that, I felt this profound calling to begin sharing my experience to help others and to create change. And so, because of that, I had this inner mantra develop that the crimes of others against me was not my shame to carry. And that was such a powerful statement for me to internalize. And that is what began me starting to speak out against my experience of being a multi generational child bride and ultimately using my story to advocate for the end of child marriage through legislation.
So, when most people hear child marriage, they think that that happens in some other faraway country. Most people don't realize that that is happening here and now.
Yes, exactly. And, I think when I speak with people about child marriage in the United States, that's something that is so shocking to them because they do associate it with developing countries or countries that may be considered to be impoverished. But when you look at the statistics, you see that in the United States, since the year 2000, so we're talking a pretty recent period of time, there have been approximately 300,000 cases of child marriage that have occurred. And I know when we hear that statistic, it's shocking, but then folks tend to go on to say, oh, well, surely those are cases between a 16 and a 17-year-old, right? But what we have found again in analyzing the statistics state by state is that the majority of those cases were where the child, most oftentimes bride, was married off to someone that was so much older than her that had that marriage license not been granted, it could have been prosecuted as a statutory rape case. Here in Kentucky, as an example, when we pulled the data, we found that there was a 13-year-old girl married off to a 33-year-old man, a 15-year-old girl married to a 52-year-old man. These are cases that is an obviously predatory situation, but those predators were able to hide their offenses behind a marriage license. It's a horrible situation. I also am aware that, folks wonder, well, how is this happening? And whereas parental consent is certainly at play in a lot of situations, I prefer to think about that as parental coercion because unfortunately, there are a lot of situations where parents don't necessarily have the best thing in mind for their kids. That's evidenced by so many child abuse cases. But in addition to parental consent, there's also judicial approval. And judicial approval generally occurs in states where there is no floor for marriage, but there's a pregnancy involved. So before we changed the laws in Kentucky, just as an example, that 13-year-old girl that I mentioned and the 15-year-old girl that I mentioned, they were pregnant and they had to go before a judge who knew that they were pregnant, who knew that they were being preyed upon by these older men. And those judges, because of the way the law was written in Kentucky, those judges allowed these children to be married off to their rapist, essentially. So, again, it's so problematic here in the United States. When children marry, they don't have accessibility to the same protective services that they would. They're not able to advocate for their own health care because they're still considered a minor. There's so many barriers, and it perpetuates this cycle of generational trauma and poverty and lack of education and chronic medical conditions. And we have to be able to address this at the legislative level first, so that then we have the protections in place to really start disrupting those cycles of generational trauma.
It would seem, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it would seem that these predators are really hiding behind these marriage license because it doesn't sound like anything can happen to them after they get that.
That is absolutely the case. The predators are absolutely hiding behind the marriage license. And I go into my own personal experience with this in my book. But just to give you a high level overview, my situation was particularly egregious. I had been abused growing up. My mother herself was a child bride. She married at 13 years of age to a man nearly twice her age that already had two young sons from his first marriage. So my mother had to become a mother herself at 13. And so, because this was normalized in her family, because she never was able to get healing from the abuse that she suffered, I ended up enduring many different forms of abuse during my childhood. And that resulted in me being admitted to a behavioral health facility when I was 14. And instead of getting the help that I needed there, that's where my abuse was perpetuated at the hands of a mental health professional working at that facility. He was 29 years old and he started grooming me. He had access to all of my information. He knew the trauma that I had experienced in my early life. He knew that my father had passed away when I was 13. He knew all the inner conflict that I had around that, as my father was one of my abusers. And so when I was released from that facility, he groomed me, but he also groomed my mother. And my mother allowed me to have this dating, and I always use quotes when I say that because there was nothing dating about it, but she allowed me to see him. And then when I was 16, she married me off to him. Because he was in a position of authority over me, and because the age difference between us was so vast, his involvement with me could have been prosecuted as statutory rape. But because my mother married me off to him, I ended up having no recourse to be able to file charges against him once I realized how incredibly horrific that marriage had impacted my life. And it contributed to my own trauma. He was extremely abusive. He exploited me sexually. He had me working in a strip club to completely take away any credibility I would have and traumatize me further. And I had no recourse. I also had no education. I had to drop out of the 10th grade when that marriage occurred and begin working full time. So, the marriage, yes, it was an abusive situation. Yes, it was exploitive. But even further than that, I had so many barriers to be able to get out of that cycle. And ultimately, I did end up going on and getting my GED, and then I put myself through college. But there were so many hurdles to that and so much adversity in that that wouldn't have had to be there had it not been for the legality of child marriage.
Do you feel that changing the laws around child marriage would also help you be able to prosecute your abuser?
Yes, I believe that changing legislation is multifaceted. We absolutely need to pass legislation at the federal level that would ban child marriage from occurring. And that is to be the most protective situation of minors. There's other laws that we really need to address as well, though, including the statute of limitations. It's really incredible when you look at the statistics that reflect that with the statute of limitations, a lot of times different states have such restrictive timeframes in which a person can disclose childhood sexual abuse that by the time they have reached a place in their life where they are ready to share that information, the law has surpassed, the time frame within the law has surpassed for them to be able to disclose that and press charges. Women are typically in their 50s before they reach the place within them that they feel that they are safe and healthy enough to be able to disclose. And it makes sense because when you get out of a traumatic situation from childhood, you're spending so much of those first few decades of your life trying to form your life, right? Trying to distance yourself from that past. And that is, of course, if you're not perpetuating those cycles of trauma yourself. You're in this healing journey. And a lot of times while you're building the plane, you can't be flying it at the same time. So when you get to that point where you've done your work, you've established security within yourself, you've established security within your relationships, that is when within you it feels safe to be able to disclose the abuse. So the statute of limitations is certainly tied to child marriage reform.
I'd like to touch on how generational trauma kind of perpetuates a cycle of poverty and lack of education and abuse.
Absolutely. So for my mother, just as an example, she was 13 when she was married off to my father. She had an eighth grade education. And because of that, she didn't have access really to any prosperous employment herself. She was very codependent on my dad. And when you look at generational cycles of trauma, there is a huge intersectionality with poverty, with the lack of education, with ongoing abuse. And if you think about it, if you are in a situation where you have experienced chronic trauma, you have a heightened risk to also have chronic health conditions. And if you have chronic health conditions and you don't feel well, then you're not able to work sustainably. And if you're not able to work sustainably, then for one, you likely don't have access to health care. And for the other, you don't have access to a sustainable income to be able to support yourself and your family. And so the cycle just perpetuates because then the position that you're in could be a lack of access to mental health care, if that is something that you struggle with, That could create heightened anxieties, heightened frustrations, a lack of coping skills to deal with that. And so that trauma and that visibility to trauma is passed on to our children, who in turn internalize it themselves. It's this very cyclical impact where if we don't address the intersectionality of poverty, lack of healthcare, lack of education with generational trauma, then we are going to continue, as we have been, spinning our wheels and never really able to break the cycle. And that's why it's so important for folks to stand up, develop self awareness, and say, this cycle is going to stop with me, and I'm going to join a coalition to make sure that that happens.
I'd like to talk about the advocacy work that you're doing. Why don't you share with us all the things that you're involved in? Because I know that this is such a big piece of your life right now.
It is, absolutely. My advocacy work is my purpose in this season of my life. I have been able to take the trauma that I experienced early on and transform it into actionable purpose. And in doing so, I am a governor appointed member of the Kentucky Juvenile Justice Advisory Board. And through that work, I work with several public servants and stakeholders all over the state of Kentucky to address situations of juvenile justice involvement. So these are kids that a lot of times have come from families where there is generational trauma. And so the outward behaviors from these kids are expressions of that. And I, of course, having firsthand experience with this, am very aware that that early intervention and breathing life into these kids and showing them there is a different way than how they grew up is so important in starting to disrupt those cycles. And in addition to my work with the Juvenile Justice Advisory Board, I am also an advocate against child marriage. I have worked since 2016 at various state levels to at least make progress in states, achieving greater protections for kids around the topic of child marriage. Though I am very much of the mindset that the best protection is age 18, legal adulthood. But I am aware also that there are some states that hasn't been agreeable, and I don't want good to be the enemy of perfect. So if we can make progress, that to me is at least moving forward. The other part is there's actually federal legislation that was filed in the US Senate in August of 2024. It has not made any movement, but I'm really hoping that we are able to begin getting folks' attention on this and pushing that forward. I actually have a meeting next week with a congressman to discuss this, and I'm hopeful that we can get a companion bill introduced in the House that will help to propel this activity forward. And again, at the end of the day, when we are talking about cycles of poverty, we're complaining about unemployment rates, we're complaining about lack of health care, we're complaining about all of the chronic conditions. We have to understand that a big part of the root for each of those problems is generational trauma. That is where we must start putting our focus to start prevention. And a big common sense way to initiate that is by ending laws that perpetuate those harms.
So let's discuss the role of therapy and self awareness in the community. Like, how can we get to this place where this is being more accepted and we can end these cycles of generational trauma? What would you say are the good ways to kind of move forward with that?
That's a really great question, and I'm glad that you brought up therapy. I very much feel that therapy is an incredibly useful tool for beginning to develop self awareness. I will say, particularly in my situation, since a big part of my exploitation was caused by a person posing as a mental health professional, I had a lot of issues with trusting people in a therapeutic environment for a while. And so a lot of my work, especially early on, was based in being self reflective. I think the ultimate success is really achieved by developing self awareness and being receptive to develop self awareness. When we are able to recognize the pain that we carry in our life, and we're able to recognize the behaviors that we have that are reflective of that, whether that's something as seemingly simplistic as jealousy, right? Like, are we experiencing a very normal emotion of jealousy if someone appears to be more attractive than us or has had more opportunities or, what have you? That example is coming from some emotional trigger. It's coming from a wound that's deeper within us. So, if we can examine what is not working in our lives, what's keeping us in this state of insecurity and keeping us in this state of not feeling fulfilled, then we can start doing the work on ourselves to really heal those wounds. And a big part of it is allowing ourselves to talk about it. Because I know my mom's generation and her mom's generation, they didn't talk about these things. Child abuse was a very taboo topic. And allowing ourselves to realize that there is no shame in owning our stories and to allow ourselves that experience frees us. And it gives us the opportunity to stand up for ourselves in a way that maybe we weren't stood up for early on. That is where the ultimate healing starts to initiate. And it also helps us connect to communities of other survivors that can reflect and validate our experiences right back to us.
Do you often have other survivors of childhood marriage reach out to you to connect and share their stories?
Yes, I have had hundreds of other child marriage survivors reach out to me to share their stories, whether it is through my social media platforms, whether it is through my website. A few years ago, I was actually part of an A&E documentary entitled I Was a Child Bride. And at that point, I started having so many people reach out talking about the generational trauma within their own families, where maybe it was their grandmother or their mother or themselves that experienced this. And then again, those ongoing intersectionalities of chronically living in poverty, chronically having health conditions, chronically having mental health conditions or substance abuse issues, and to be able to connect with folks and form this community is huge because, for one thing, we need other people. We need that connection to know that we're not alone. And for the other, the more voices that are able to raise, the greater the power behind our legislative movement to give faces to these voices and ultimately end these cycles.
I think it's just amazing that there's still states where childhood marriage is legal. I just have a hard time wrapping my head around that.
Mhm. Absolutely. And in a lot of states that have been very hesitant to make progress towards legislative change, there are so many various oppositions that are vocalized. Part of it has been the fact that our culture has normalized it. If you look at the way that the media portrays teenage girls, just as an example, women, young girls are still objectified and still sexualized. And that is something that, makes some folks normalize if a man in his 30s is, lusting after a teenage girl. And we have to start disrupting that thought pattern. That is not a healthy situation for these girls. And, you know, 16, 17 years old, yes, they are on the verge of entering adulthood, but they still have so much development to go through cognitively and emotionally. The other part of it is that a lot of folks assume that these are Romeo Juliet situations. I've heard that label used several times, where they think that it's two 17-year-olds or it's a 16 and 17-year-old. And again, when you look at this statistically, that is not the case. But even if it were, those kids, if they are married, have fewer protections than what they would if they remained independent until they reached their 18th birthday. In my situation, when I was 16 and I was experiencing domestic violence, I tried to go to a shelter. I was turned away from the shelter because I was not an adult. It didn't matter that I was considered an emancipated minor because of the marriage. Again, regardless, the best protection for kids is to not put them in positions that they are not legally or emotionally ready for.
We shouldn't have children making adult decisions at any point. It just doesn't make any sense. And one of the things I love about your book is that you really help survivors kind of have this power to reclaim their narrative and take back, in many ways, the power that they've given away.
Yeah.
Can you share about that for our listeners?
Absolutely. So that very much came from my own healing journey as well. I carried so much shame around so much of my early life abuse, whether it was the childhood abuse that I experienced very early on in my life, or the abuse and exploitation by the predator that was 29 when I was 14. And what I realized is that through all these situations, even after I had escaped and emerged from that toxicity, I was still carrying this narrative within my own mind about who I was. And it didn't come from my own development. It didn't come from my own sense of growth. It came from the traumatic messaging and the abusive messaging that had been imposed upon me by my abusers. And realizing that made me have this light bulb moment that I could change that narrative. I could reframe that narrative and I could reclaim my power. But in order to do that, I had to embrace my authenticity. I had to embrace the truth of where I came from, the truth of the impact that those situations had on me, and the truth about the resilience that I could feel deep within my spirit and knew that I was called to transform into a purpose filled life that would achieve protections for others. It very much came to me during my healing journey that survival itself may have been my first chapter, but that was never meant to be my last.
I think that's so empowering for so many people. Well, Donna, where can our listeners connect with you and be part of your community and learn how they can get involved in being an advocate against child marriage as well?
Yes, so I am very active on my social media platforms, particularly Facebook, where I can be found at Ashes to Flame, Transforming Trauma into Purpose. I can also be followed on my author page, which is Donna Simmons. And then on TikTok, my handle is Ashes to Flame. My website is trauma2purpose.com. And through each of these platforms, I am able to be reached. I put a lot of videos out that are really focused on drawing attention to hot topic issues that all correlate to systemic failures that we have the opportunity to change. I also provide a lot of empowerment to survivors of different forms of trauma, and I have educational material for those that work in helping professions to take a more survivor centric and trauma informed approach to their work. And again, all of that can be accessed by reaching out to me through those various social media and website platforms.
Well, Donna, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Absolutely. It was an honor to speak to you, Marianne. I really appreciate you highlighting this critical issue.
Well, thank you, Donna. It's been such an honor to spend this time with you and to talk about your journey and book, Ashes to Flame, Transforming Trauma into Purpose. Make sure to visit Donna's website at traumatopurpose.com. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in. You've been listening to Moments with Mary Ann, where we make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Mary Ann is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Mary Ann will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmaryann.com for more information.